This is Joe Bacino with the All American Legacy Podcast. This is a special show. We're releasing this on Veterans Day. Veterans Day 2017, we've got two guests, Dr. Joe Kuhill, a historian based in Pittsburgh. You know him as Professor Buzzkill. He's been on this show before. He has the Professor Buzzkill podcast. Check him out. Check him out on Twitter. And then we've got Dr. Phil Nash, who is a historian at Penn State, esteemed historian. He's been on this show before as well.
This is the 82nd Airborne Division, fearless among fighting units.
From Fort Bragg, home of the Airborne and the center of the military universe, this is the All-American Legacy Podcast. An inside look at the 100-year history of the 82nd.
They are all American all the way.
This is Phil Nash here, Penn State University. Glad to be taking part.
And this is Joe Kuhill, as Colonel Bacino said, also known as Professor Buzzkill. Very glad to be taking part. It's a great subject and a great podcast.
So what is Professor Buzzkill for the uninformed?
The uninformed and the unenlightened. Professor Buzzkill is a podcast that takes history myths, busts them, and explains history misconceptions. But also, while we're doing that, we talk about the sort of broader issue related to whatever episode the myth is connected to. And fortunately for the Professor Buzzkill Institute and for Buzzkill Nation, Professor Nash, who's on the other line, is one of our most frequent contributors and our most popular historian.
And
thank you for that.
You've both been on the All American Legacy Podcast before. In fact, the Operation Market Garden, that episode, the episode that Dr. Nash appeared on, is our third most popular.
Oh, nice to know.
Okay.
Yeah, I always tell people to listen to that one and to other ones. So I like the 82nd podcast very, very much.
Good.
Same here.
Okay. Well, look, let's just get right into it here. So this is Veterans Day. Today's Veterans Day, the day this is being released, and we're talking about what Veterans Day mean and what it has come to mean for the nation. And let's just start there. When did Veterans Day come about? How did we start celebrating this?
Well, actually, can I first provide maybe the deeper context?
Please.
My understanding that there's still some people who confuse Memorial Day and Veterans Day.
Yeah.
Because Memorial Day came from the American Civil War, and it only commemorated those who died in military service. So that's an important backdrop because, of course, Armistice Day and then Veterans Day is for all veterans, not just those who died in military service.
And it's not the same in every country. The British have a Memorial Day, which is called Remembrance Sunday, that they observe right next to, as close as they can, to the actual November 11th day, which they still call Armistice Day.
Right. As do some other countries, I believe, not just Britain.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It also, I was curious to learn this. It also ends up eclipsing the date of the signing of the Mayflower Compact, which was signed on November 11th, 1620, which established the rules for governing the Plymouth colony. And apparently there were at least a few people who, in the 20th century, argued that really that was more important, and so it should get its day instead. That was the Mayflower Compact is sort of like, in some ways, the origins of American government in a way. But unfortunately, it was bad timing. They got eclipsed by Veterans Day.
Well, what I think is so interesting about Veterans Day is that it's kind of slow in the United States to get going. I mean, the President Wilson has an address on November 11th in 1919 to talk about what happened on November 11th, 1918. But it really isn't that until 1926 under Coolidge that, the sort of order or the request goes out that annual observances of November 11th need to happen. So that shows a lot of these things in history don't start immediately after you would think they do. They take a while to get going. The Star Spangled Banner, for instance, doesn't become a national song until 1931. So things take a while to get going, and it's kind of surprising in this instance because November 11th was decided we're gonna stop firing on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. It's very deliberate about the date and time. Yet in some places, like the United States, it's kind of slow to get going.
Right. And not only gradual, but also my impression is somewhat organic, because in 1926, when the Congress passes the resolution to observe 11/11, about I think it was 27 states had already been doing it on their own. So in a way, you sort of see the sort of federalism in action, and I think that in a way, the federal government was just making it official what a lot of states had already begun to do on their own.
And so let's just set the table here. November 11th of 1918, there's an armistice that ends World War I, known as the Great War.
Correct.
So initially, Armistice Day, which would become Veterans Day, was really just an observation of the veterans who participated in that war, who brought about the armistice.
Correct.
Right.
And so
one of the interesting things and one of the tragic things is that the armistice is signed very early in the morning on November 11th, but they decide to wait to be symbolic for the actual firing to stop at 11 a.m. And between that early morning signing or the early morning agreement and 11 a.m., a lot of soldiers die. The fighting just keeps continuing, and it doesn't officially until 11.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that's interesting...
Symbolic importance. Yeah.
The symbolic, yeah.
And one thing that is interesting to me is, as I look at the initial observation of Armistice Day, is that it was certainly in some ways, a little more somber, a little more solemn than the way we observe Veterans Day today. And I wonder if that's because there was never a real true end to the war. There was only an armistice with the notion that this could continue in the future. Is there anything to that?
Well, you're absolutely right. The armistice is not really the official end of the war. It's a ceasefire, and the war doesn't officially end until the signing of the Versailles Treaty. And also what you may be referring to is that since the United States Senate does not end up ratifying the Versailles Treaty, that the United States then has to go and conclude sort of side peace treaties on its own with all the enemy powers, which I think lasts until something like 1921. So, then to me that's also interesting that you don't mark the official end of the war. You you mark the end of the fighting, which is what an armistice is. An armistice is just a ceasefire. It's like we're not going to kill each other anymore. But when you officially declare war, you have to officially declare peace. And so it's not officially over until the peace treaty is signed, and that's not more for another 6 months later in the case of everyone else, and then even later for the United States because of these separate peace treaties.
And then I think it's important, though, in Europe and especially in Britain, that people have sort of forgotten what armistice actually means. They tend to think of it as peace, as the end of the war. But you're right; it's just a big ceasefire.
Right.
I think there was also probably not just in the United States, a big assumption at the time that since this war had been so catastrophic and on such a massive scale, it was called the Great War, right? They didn't know to number them yet.
Yeah.
And it was considered what was called the war to end all wars. And I think when people chose to commemorate afterwards, I think a lot of them assumed that you would never see anything like this again. So I think that was an additional sort of impetus behind officially commemorating it.
And that's a very big deal because, of course, as we tend to forget, especially people in our lifetime, when the European Union has been in effect, and there hasn't been a major European war since World War II, a major European war on the continent of Europe anyway. There's a war every generation in Europe before 1914 and before World War I. It's a very, very bloody place. For instance, the Germans fight all the time.
Pretty much.
You can just keep going back. And so when World War I happens and, everybody jumps in, so to speak, and it's so bloody because it's so mechanized and so modern, and it's very much a shock to the system for a continent that is already used to war.
Right, and that's important. And also in that context, in some ways it's a bigger deal for the Americans because we had broken with tradition. We had fought Europeans several times before, but we had never fought in Europe. This was a big break with American tradition. We tended to fight in the Western Hemisphere. So for us to gear up and go and fight in a major European war, that was, in terms of of that generation compared to other generations of Americans, that was a really big deal.
So let's move out.
Also,
Let's just move out of the World War I and then take a look at how was Veterans Day observed while we were in and while we were gearing up for World War II and while we were participating in World War II.
Right. Actually, I think I just first, before we move on, just throw in this quote, because this is from Woodrow Wilson's statement on the 1 year anniversary. So this is November 11th, 1919. He basically declaring sort of this one time, at the time, a one-off commemoration of the event. He says, and I'm quoting, "To us in America, the reflections of Armistice Day will be filled with solemn pride in the heroism of those who died in the country's service, and with gratitude for the victory, both because of the thing from which it has freed us," and of course earlier he had talked about aggression and things like that, from the things from which it has freed us, and because of the opportunity it has given America to show her sympathy with peace and justice in the councils of nations. So that's, and in my view, that's sort of a very Wilsonian statement. In other words, it's not just looking back, but it's also sort of looking forward. I thought that was kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm. Well, it keeps, as we both said, it sort of gets this, goes through a slow start, both 1919, but then 1926 and 1938, and it keeps getting observed, but it really, after the war, World War II, the idea is to expand Armistice Day to a Veterans Day, not just for World War II, the soldiers who died in World War. Sorry, I should say soldiers who died in World War I. Right. And,
but during
it doesn't become a legal holiday until 1938 by Act of Congress. So that's for further proof of this very gradual process.
And then during the execution of World War II, how did we observe Armistice Day? Did we continue to reflect back on World War I? Was it sort of forgotten about a little bit?
Yeah, as far as I know, I don't think it had changed that much during the war, but it's immediately after the war where there's this fellow, Raymond Weeks, who I think has gone down in history as the father of Veterans Day, who sort of makes it his personal crusade to change it into something that celebrates all veterans, not just World War I veterans. And, let's keep in mind many, many more folks served in the military during World War II than in World War I. World War I think, was about 4 million, and World War II was about 4 times that, about 16 million people. And so he starts pushing to have this, once again, when they first did it in the 20s and 30s, they didn't think there would be another one, and now here's another one which is much, much bigger. So,
and also,
I think if it wouldn't have been Raymond Weeks, it would have been somebody else. But folks like him want to be marked, observed as well.
But also during the war, November 11th was a time when bond drives would increase, and there would obviously be parades in towns and things like that. So, I'm not saying that people were, illegitimately using Veterans Day to bolster war funding and that sort of stuff in World War II, but they were using Veterans Day to say, look, we have to remember that not only is this happening now, but it happened 20 years ago, and that's what one of these things. World War I was the war to end all wars, and here we are again. If we have another big bond drive, we might be able to stop it.
Right. Yeah, and you can actually see that in a fair amount of World War II American propaganda. There are all sorts of references to World War I. And partly because it hadn't been that long before, and a lot of people still remembered it. So it became a sort of historical rallying point, which is, I think is what you're sort of talking about.
Yeah, and also we've got to remember that. To go back to World War I a little bit, a lot of the sort of national celebrations we have, and the use of the flag and the use of the Star Spangled Banner and things like that, really date from World War I and U.S. participation in World War I. It was a way to not only get the country behind the war, but also to keep the country's attention on the war when the soldiers were so far away. And of course, that's only increases in World War II.
Right, absolutely. Also, remember, in terms of, once again, the scale is really important. And the United States, apart from the Civil War, which belongs in its own category, the United States had never nearly mobilized to the same extent that it had in World War I. If you look at the Spanish-American War, for example, that was a quick war where only a tiny, tiny segment of the country was mobilized. You didn't have a draft. You didn't have any of those sorts of things. Whereas World War I really is on massive scale, and so many more people are affected by it directly or indirectly. There is really no comparison.
And then World War II, as we keep saying, is even bigger. even bigger.
Right. And so Raymond Weeks's struggle to get this holiday or this commemoration broadened lasts for years. And it's not until 1954, after both World War II and the Korean War had intervened, that I almost said Franklin Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, the president, and of course World War II hero, signed into law an act that declares that Armistice Day counts for all veterans, not just World War I veterans. And then just a few days later, it was amended, and the word armistice was replaced with veterans. And so it's not until 1954 that it sort of takes its current form.
Yeah, and that's almost within Phil's lifetime.
Yeah.
Almost.
I'm ragging him because I'm 6 months older than he is. Gives me no more.
Technically my senior. And also, while we're at it, I was curious to know, it's veterans with no apostrophe.
Yeah. Right.
That's
Veteran
right.
with an S. So just for those who are big on spelling, there's no punctuation in that word.
Right. So it seems as though during the Korean War, we didn't really, I think, appreciate, and maybe in some ways we still do not appreciate the veterans of that war. Perhaps we didn't fully, understand we understood the point of World War II, and we felt a real threat. If you read the accounts from the early 1940s, but I think that wasn't felt perhaps in the early 1950s about Korea.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, it's called the Forgotten War for a reason. And I think for a long, long time, a lot of Korean War veterans felt that they had been sort of slighted. And in that sense, I think, that's one of the many reasons why I think it's a good thing that it was broadened out to include all veterans. Because, and then especially after Korea, when we have so many sort of brush fire wars, both large and small, and quick little actions and much longer actions, it's a much better approach than just to mark the veterans of one war.
Right. And then I think if you've seen, I'm sure you both have seen or watching or have seen the Ken Burns Vietnam documentary. Yeah. Certainly Veterans Day during that war, was filled with controversy, arguments, protest, and the like. And and so, that was an incredibly explosive time in terms of the way we think about veterans and people returning from war. And I feel like now we are separating the warriors from the politics of the war in which they fought. And Veterans Day observes all of our veterans with the, I think, appropriate amount of dignity.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's a really good point. And you're absolutely right about during the Vietnam period, because it almost became not the only one, but sort of a focal point for this generational clash, where you have all these World War II veterans for whom observing Veterans Day was of course not only accepted, but just sort of taken for granted, and you take part in the parade and you sort of venerate our military veterans, whereas the younger generation, many of whom had come to question the Vietnam War, didn't see it that way. And then it becomes, as you're suggesting, sort of a touch point for conflict. And I think you're right. But I think more recently things have changed quite a bit.
And so, is it accurate to say that initially the Armistice Day and then Veterans Day was more introspective, and now it's more celebratory? Now it's more of a celebration of the accomplishments of our veterans, not only for the United States but for the world?
That's a really interesting point. I'd say yes. That would be my impression. Absolutely.
I mean, call me a buzzkill if you wish, but what worries me about things like Veterans Day and increasingly as I get older, and you get a lot of people saying this as I get older sort of stuff, is Veterans Day and Memorial Day, because they're most often 3-day weekends, are, when you hear about them in sort of contemporary culture, it's like, oh, where are you going for Veterans Day? What cookout are you going to for Memorial Day?
Right.
And I worry that, peacenik though I may be, that actually, especially with Memorial Day, that the dead soldiers, the people who gave their lives, aren't being remembered seriously enough and aren't being remembered properly enough. And of course, it's very good to have picnics and everything and all that sort of stuff. But the original meaning of these things, I think, is getting lost. But again, that could be because I'm getting crusty because I'm 6 months older than Phil.
You know what? I honestly could not agree more. And I would, in fact, I brought it out. I think that's true of some of our other holidays. I mean, think about Labor Day, for example.
Yeah, right.
You know, this sort of, I mean, not to go political, but sort of the interests of labor, you know, used to be taken much more seriously, you know, and that was a day in which you actually sort of, you know, you didn't give thanks or anything, but you sort of showed your appreciation for people who work hard. And I think you're right. I think now they become these sort of generic, undifferentiated holidays where it's like, yeah, what are you doing? Where are you going? How are you going to spend your time off? Never, I mean, it's never even enters people's heads like, what will you do to observe the purpose of this holiday? I think that's an excellent point.
And I think maybe the only reason July 4th isn't observed that way, or at least has a little bit of more attention to its history, is that it's always on July 4th. It's never the Monday, the closest Monday. And, you know, there are readings of the Declaration of Independence and things like that. But, you know, again, I worry a little bit about the creeping towards the barbecue.
Right. Now, wait a minute, though. Now, Veterans Day is observed always on November 11th, but in terms of, like, federal workers getting a day off, sometimes it's moved to a Monday. Isn't that the truth? That's right. Yeah. Right. Because I know in the 70s, I was looking into this, in the 70s, there was this brief mess where they tried to, I guess, pick the 4 holidays, including Veterans Day, and always make sure they were on a Monday so that you had these 3-day clusters 4 times a year. And so they moved it, and it became a mess. And they ultimately undid it later in the 70s. But there is this brief period where it does, where they went back to the original arrangement.
Yeah. I think one of the reasons for that is because, you know, they saw what was going on. I mean, there were, as you say, Phil, there were Congress people who complained about this and wanted to go back. They saw that, you know, it's held very, very reverentially in France and in Britain and in Germany. Sure. And it has to be the 11th. You know, they're not kidding around. And so, you know, it's hard for Americans who didn't start fighting the war until 1917 anyway, to say, well, we're just going to treat it as the next Monday.
Right. In Europe, isn't it true that they tend to actually mark the actual, not just the day, but the time? Don't they, like, sort of ring the bells or have a moment of silence or whatever at the actual 11th minute of the 11th hour, et cetera?
Yeah, and you'll see people stop in the street. People are walking to the bank or whatever they're doing. They will, as they're walking along, when those bells stop, they will literally stop, and the street will be stopped. Now, of course, it's not as common as it used to be, but even in the 90s, when I was in England in graduate school, I knew about it already, and I was still surprised at how serious it was taken. Seriously, it was taken.
Right. Well, keep in mind, these are also countries that had significantly smaller populations than ours, and yet lost many more dead than we did. Yeah. As you say, they were fighting for so much longer. You know, France lost 1.3 million dead, Britain 900,000 dead. You know, and so it's not like we got out scot-free. You know, we suffered serious losses, about 130,000 dead, but still, you know, a much larger percentage of their populations were directly affected. Let me put it that way. So, I wouldn't be surprised if they.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah.
All right. This was a great discussion. Anything else we need to add here to close this out on Veterans Day?
I don't think so. Maybe if we get in on a less somber note, but of course that's the thing that I'm complaining about.
Yeah. Well, so I think just to close this out, maybe on a more perhaps more optimistic tone here, is that, you know, this is a time in our country right now that we're at sort of an inflection point. Although if you watch the Ken Burns show, we've been at this inflection point many times, the same inflection point, where you know, we're talking about our elected officials, and we're talking about our freedoms, and we're talking about police brutality, we're talking about civil rights and things of that nature. And, you know, it's always, I think, important to reflect on how much we have how much freedom, how much security, how much stability we have compared to virtually almost the entire rest of the world. And that is a result of Our veterans certainly, we may not agree with all of our nation's wars, but we need our nation's warriors. We need someone to protect these freedoms, to protect these rights, and to allow us to evolve as a society, to allow us to evolve our civil rights and to allow us to evolve our liberties. And that's really that sacred pact between warrior and society. And I think it's important to reflect on that November 11th.
Yeah, very good. Very well put. No question.
All right, Doctors Kuhill and Nash, thanks for joining me.
Our pleasure. Great to be here.
We had a good talk. We talked about the origin of Veterans Day. It's something that is misunderstood. The origin of Veterans Day, how Veterans Day has evolved, why we celebrate it, how we celebrate it, what it means. And so we cleared up some myths and we brought some truth here. And that's really the point of this episode. This episode is based on Veterans Day, the commemoration thereof, and why we celebrate Veterans Day. All right, thanks for listening. Look, we need you to leave a rating and a review on iTunes for the All American Legacy podcast. Please leave a 5-star rating. That is working. It's helping others to find the show. All right, thanks. Tell others about the All American Legacy podcast.